Hey, welcome to the Healthy Postnatal Body Podcast with your postnatal expert, Peter Lapp. That, as always, would be me. This is a podcast for the 2nd of March 2025, and, day before music means I have a guest on. I'm talking to Bev Mitelman. I mentioned that this episode was coming up. We're talking attachment theory, how to build healthy relationships, how to teach your kids what a healthy relationship looks like, how to have healthy relationships with partners and colleagues and all that type of stuff. This one was mind-blowing to me. This was so remarkably good. Bev really knows what she's talking about and is very clear in explaining it. You're going to absolutely love this one. It'll be an eye-opener. I promise you, it definitely was for me. So without further ado, here we go. So what exactly is attachment theory?
So that's a great place to start. So attachment theory is a theory based on how it is that we as humans create an emotional bond.
Right.
And it starts really, really early on. In our earliest days, we are most suggestible as humans from the time period of 0, so firstborn, till about 5 years old. Which makes sense. We come out of the oven and we're a blank slate.
Yeah.
So everything that we hear and we experience and we see and we feel creates a template in our mind, almost like a set of subconscious rules for how we are to interrelate with other people and how we are to give and receive love. And in the earliest years, this is usually most commonly played out with a primary caregiver, oftentimes the mother, but it can, of course, be a father. It could be, let's say, an aunt. It could be a grandmother, whoever is the primary caregiver. Now, what comes of this is actually really, really important. The type of interaction that a very young child will receive with that primary caregiver sets out, again, a pattern by which they will use over and over and over again in their adult years. Right. So when we talk about, that's the theory. Now, out of the theory, there's different attachment styles that have emerged, right? Out of this theory of how we emotionally bond and connect to others. So in generality, there are two broad categories. One is an individual who has a secure connection. Right? Or attachment. And the other one would be someone who has an insecure attachment. Right. So we'll start with the person who has a secure attachment. So the child who is lucky enough to grow up in a home whereby there's a fair degree of consistent and predictable emotional attunement from their caregiver. Which means, even when the child is pre-verbal, if the child, for example, cries or shows distress, that the primary caregiver will respond in a healthy way.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean, I want to be very careful because, we're talking to a group of parents and I myself am a mother. I've raised 2 sons. They're both away at university now. And I could say hands down, I did not do everything perfectly. So I want to be really clear. This is not about shaming parents. It's not about perfection. But what the child is looking for in order to create this secure attachment is consistency, predictability. So when a caregiver responds to a child, for example, in distress, or a child that wants comfort, or even a child who's just playful and wants the attention of their caregiver, when the caregiver responds in a healthy way, that creates a level of safety and trust for the child. So the child trusts in themselves. They learn to identify their emotions. They learn to communicate their emotions. And they also trust in others that they will be responded to in a healthy way. So that sets out a beautiful template for a child to then grow up and spread their wings out into the world, where they're now, as teenagers and young adults and well into our adult years, they're now forming all types of relationships with family members, with friends, with colleagues, and of course, romantic partners.
Mhm.
Right? So this creates an individual that's quite comfortable with their own emotions. They understand their emotional patterns. They're quite emotionally regulated, oftentimes very good communicators,
Right.
very good with boundaries. They understand their needs, and they can enter into, for example, a long-term romantic partnership and be very comfortable in the state of interdependence, where I can soothe myself and give myself my own needs, but I can also do that in partnership.
Mm.
Both feel comfortable to me, right? So
Yeah.
that's the utopia. That's where we want to go. Right. And I'm sure, Peter, I'll ask you, do you know some people like this who have been in long-term relationships, who are emotionally regulated, who just,
Oh yeah.
generally,
But to be fair, only one or two. Let's be honest. Let's be honest.
yeah,
Because I'm 50, so all my
yeah,
friends are of a certain generation and a certain, not just a certain age, but it's more a certain generation. And we were raised by people from a certain generation. And as you're probably familiar with, most people in their 50s are pretty messed up, right? Right?
yeah. Unfortunately, that is a true statement. So I'm also almost 50. I'm
right?
49, so close enough for the
Yeah.
sake of argument here. And I also did not live the childhood that I've described.
Yeah.
So I think parenting was a little different back then.
Mhm.
Maya Angelou has a beautiful quote that says, "When you know better, do better." So
Right.
we
Yes.
now know better in
Yeah.
terms of child development. And so, it's our job to say, this is really what's best for a child in terms of healthy emotional development. So
Mm.
I believe our parents did the best they could with what they had at the time, but 50 years ago, we
Yeah.
didn't have the same information.
So how then? Because for a lot of people, right, and I know a lot of American listeners, especially, therapy is very common in America. I'm guessing it's similar in Canada. In the UK, very much not so, right? But moving in that direction, it is very.
Good.
And on the continent, hardly at all. I mean, I'm Dutch, and I don't know any Dutch people that went to see a therapist unless they were like a psychopath or anything like that. Right? Whenever we watch any sort of American
They were
television,
forced.
yes, pretty. Yeah, it has to be
Yeah.
court mandated therapy, and you all
Yeah,
end
they
up
do
sitting
willingly.
in a group. It's always anger management or something like that. But so how do you break the cycle? Because it's very interesting when you talk about predictability, as in the predictability of response. When a child, or even a partner turns to their partner, or the child turns to their parent and is trying to get something, as in trying to elicit a response, and the parent responds in an unpredictable manner. So as in, you
Mm,
never know what you're going to get. That was very much my home
mm,
life. That's one day it might
yeah,
be great, the other day you might be in trouble, right? Um,
right.
and how do you then break what quite often is the initial? Because I had to work pretty hard to not turn into my dad when I was 35, 40 years old. Do you know what I mean? Everybody turns into their parents unless we're very, very careful. That is just kind of how it goes.
Unless you're aware,
Yeah,
unless
unless
you're
you're aware.
aware and you can
Yeah.
identify the patterns that are healthy and the patterns that aren't. So that's a beautiful question. How do you disrupt this pattern and then
Mhm.
really move away from intergenerational trauma, right? Because it's
Yeah,
very
exactly.
easy to
Yes.
take what your parents gave you and pass it on to your kids and they pass it on
Mhm.
to your kids. So if it's okay with you, with your permission, I'll ask to park that question for a few
Go for
minutes.
it. Yeah.
But don't forget it because it's a very important question. But what I want to do for your audience is to dive into what insecure attachment actually looks like,
Of
because
course.
we talked about secure attachment and now insecure attachment.
Mhm.
Now, in North America, the statistics are about 40% of the population has a secure attachment and about 60% has an insecure attachment. So it's a large segment of the population. Okay. So within the range of insecure attachment, there's 3 subtypes and they're on a continuum. So on one end of the spectrum, we have what we call an anxious attacher or someone who is anxious preoccupied. On the other end of the spectrum, we have what's called an avoidant attacher or someone who's dismissive avoidant.
Right.
And somewhere in the middle, with qualities of both the anxious and the avoidant, we have the fearful avoidant, which is also called a disorganized attacher.
Right.
Now, why does this matter? Essentially, all of these folks came out of a home where they did not receive the predictable, consistent emotional attunement that they needed. And there are so many examples that I'll throw out just a few so people get an idea. So, for example, there could be a child who's living in a home with, let's say, a mother who's an alcoholic. Okay. That behavior is highly unpredictable. One day they're drunk, the next day they're happy, one day they're passed out. The child doesn't know if they can rely on the parent to meet their needs, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes children are living in a home, for example, where the mother has too many children to take care of. And so a child really doesn't get the attention they need. Sometimes children are growing up in homes where they're a part of a high demand religion. And it's extremely strict, and everything is very controlled. Sometimes a child is growing up in a home where a caregiver has a mental illness. And we know that behaviors associated to mental illness are generally highly unpredictable, which can be very scary for a child, right? Or, we see this far too often, unfortunately, where children also grow up in a home where there's all kinds of abuse. Verbal abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and it could be sexual abuse too. It could be all of the above. And so that's just a snapshot of some of the scenarios, but you can see there's huge variance, right? So why does this matter? Well, all 3 of these subtypes, they share one common core wound that they carry from their childhood. And that core wound is, I am unsafe.
Right. That makes sense.
Okay?
Yeah.
So they feel unsafe in themselves. They oftentimes cannot emotionally regulate. They're quite volatile. They never learned how to self-soothe. It was never modeled for them. Oftentimes, people become very disconnected from their own emotions as a way to sort of cope in this world. So all of these subtypes that we're talking about, the anxious, the avoidant, and the fearful avoidant, have very distinct emotional patterns, communication patterns, and coping mechanisms, behaviors for how they're going to deal with what they perceive as being, what's safe and trustworthy. And so when this becomes incredibly apparent is when these individuals go to form new relationships in adulthood. Because we talked about how the template that's created, like that imprint, it gets reused and reused. Subconsciously, people don't realize they're doing this. So the child who had a very unpredictable mother will be the adult who grows up, for example, in a romantic relationship and is anxious, preoccupied. And these people oftentimes feel very lonely. They feel very sad. They have core wounds around, I will be abandoned. I am not good enough. I am unlikable. I will be excluded. And oftentimes what we see is they choose romantic partners that are unpredictable and emotionally unavailable, and they spend a whole lot of time chasing and running after these people in the same way that mirrors the dynamic that they once had with their caregiver, right? All of their focus becomes the other person. They become massive people pleasers, which no doubt started in childhood.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's how they perceive love. They perceive love how it's given and how it's received under that lens where the other person's needs are far more important than my own. Right.
Yeah.
Now, these are the people who tend to be called, I don't really love names, but we tend to call these people, clingy, needy. They need a lot of external validation, reassurance, because they can't give it to themselves. Right.
That makes
So
sense.
it makes sense. Right. And we see this, and I'm sure people in your life who are like this as well.
For sure.
Yeah. So if you dig a little, you'll find that they had one or both of their caregivers who were highly unpredictable, right? Who emotionally abandoned them. Yeah, you'll see the pattern.
Yeah.
It's very prescriptive. So if we jump to the other side of the spectrum and the avoidance generally come out of a home whereby they were emotionally neglected. So these are children who spent a lot of time alone. These were children who were often sent to their rooms because they were quote unquote bad. And they had to, by themselves, figure out how to deal with all of these emotions. Their coping strategy that they developed is they just put a wall up, a defense mechanism. They shut down their emotions, they repressed them, and they became very distrustful of others. Now, if a child cannot trust their mother, for example, to provide comfort and safety and security, it will be extremely difficult to convince that person as an adult that they can trust others.
Sure.
Right? Because they don't have the model for that. That's not what their life experience didn't teach them that. Right? So these folks become hyper independent, overly self-reliant. They really value their freedom, their independence. They're often seen as secretive, but it's because they're scared of vulnerability. They really don't want people to get too emotionally close. And their core wound is a shame wound, right? So the shame wound being, I am defective. These folks deep down inside feel that there is something wrong with them. It is their fault that they didn't get the love and the comfort that they needed as a child. A child doesn't have the ability to say, my mother is having a bad day, so, that's why she's acting this way. Every child will respond in the same way. There must be something that I said or did, or there must be something wrong with me, or my mother would be kinder to me.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And right? And so they grow up with this core wound of I am defective. And in order to keep themselves safe, they keep people at an emotional distance. And so what happens is when they go to get into long-term relationships, they're very slow to commit. The idea of sacrificing or losing their independence their freedom is very, very scary. They have these expectations from childhood that I'm going to manage my emotions, which means you as my partner, you're going to manage yours. It's not my job.
Good luck with that. Yep.
Yeah, it's not my job to soothe you, right? Nobody soothed me when I was a child. So it's the opposite of codependent. It's almost like parallel play, right? So it's like you do your thing, I'll do my thing. We'll come together and have fun and then go our separate ways. So these folks often are much more likely to enter into short-term relationships, casual relationships, avoid the emotional component. And so it's pretty interesting. Now, so to make things even worse for these folks, because, you have to have a level of empathy here, right? Because they did experience some difficult things. But oftentimes the anxious person, the anxious attacher and the avoidant attacher, they form a bond and they often attract each other.
Nice. That's
which
a good
is one of the most, it's a terrible combination actually, because what really, really attracts each other to one another in the initial stages is ultimately what drives them apart.
Yeah.
Because the anxious attacher, there's no such thing as too close. They always want to get closer and closer and closer.
Mhm.
And the avoidant person is generally trying to take more and more space. They feel overwhelmed when someone encroaches too much. So we call this the anxious-avoidant dance.
Right.
Right? Someone's getting closer, someone's backing up, then the other one backs up, and this one. So it's a difficult dynamic unless both partners recognize their patterns and can have open and honest conversations about this. So the last category is the fearful avoidance. Now, the fearful avoidance generally comes out of a home where there was abuse. So this is an individual who has high anxiety and high avoidance, which is a terrible ball of wax. This is how I grew up.
Right.
And which meant was, in simple terms, I very much craved closeness,
Mm-hmm.
let's say from a romantic partner, but petrified, very fearful of intimacy and vulnerability. And this really comes out of a situation whereby usually a child is being abused and harmed by the person that they love.
Right.
So in a child's psyche, they can't reconcile loving someone so much and being drawn to them for comfort and safety when that person is also the one that's either physically or psychologically or emotionally or sexually harming them.
Mm-hmm.
So it creates this, what we call in a romantic sense, the fearful avoidant is often known as the hot and the cold partner, right? So come closer to me. I want a hug. Okay, that's close enough. Back up a little bit. Let's spend a weekend together. Oh, I need a week apart.
Yeah.
That on and off. And that is, if you follow the trajectory from their childhood, it is the template that they lived in childhood.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at in terms of why this is important and these styles. Now, I want to move into the question that you asked, because these styles, while we do form them very, very young, our brain has a level of plasticity to it, right? So the neural connections that we make. So we absolutely can change and improve, if that's our objective, our attachment style over time. So your question was specifically about how to break the cycle?
Yeah, especially with regards to parenting, because I found that, like I said, as I turned into my dad, it was always the initial reaction. Right? My initial reaction is always this, and I was, that's what my dad used to do. We're not doing that anymore. Right? And then with a tremendous amount of practice, you move away from that.
Yes.
But
I love that you said that. Such a great example. So a couple of things to pull apart from what you just said. You talked about your initial reaction, which is, again, it's like your template says to do this. So you react almost without thinking, right? So the template is like a roadmap in your mind. Yeah. Right. So you feel disrespected. Let's say you're carrying a core wound of, I feel disrespected. And let's say your teenage child does something disrespectful. Now, every teenage child will do something that, they're going to do something that rubs us the wrong way, right? Yeah. But if you're carrying a core wound of I feel disrespected, you're likely going to respond in a very aggressive, almost big way, which means you might yell back 3 times louder than the child. You might blurt out something that is really mean, but you never intended to be so harmful, but you are. Yeah. Right. So your reaction, if you're carrying a core wound, I am disrespected, and you that gets triggered, your response is often very exaggerated, very big, not necessarily because of what the child did in that moment, but because they pushed on a button that you already had within you that's unhealed.
Sure.
Right? Now, so what's beautiful about what you said is that you've developed an awareness where you can have the initial reaction and then go, oh, wait a minute, that wasn't the best way to respond.
Mhm.
And then you can course correct. And over time, as you build new neural pathways, saying, I don't have to respond by yelling,
Mhm.
right? I can simply say to my child, I don't like the way you're talking to me.
Yeah.
That's just as
Yeah.
effective, right?
Yeah. It usually works better.
Yes,
Yeah.
it does. But you've really sort of brought to light the point that you can change these behaviors, right? These behaviors are simply coping mechanisms
Mm.
um, for the patterns that we have in our mind, but it's very malleable.
So obviously, a lot of people listening to this, and I know we're on a tightest schedule, but it's a lot. Would you say, because it sounds to me like a lot of people are a let's cross that bridge when we get to it sort of persuasion. Let me put it that way, right? Well, when my child is 2 or 3 or 4, that's when I'll start dealing with my with my stuff, which is a little bit late in the game, so to speak, right? And I'm thinking loads of people that are listening to this must almost everybody, if we're honest with ourselves, must be listening to this and going, I fall into XYZ category, right?
Mhm.
Surely the sooner you start working on this, the better it is.
100%. So
Yeah.
the best thing we can do for our children, and I want to be clear, it's never too late,
Sure.
right? Wherever you're at, the best thing you can do for your children is to learn about your own attachment style
Mhm.
and to ensure that you yourself are emotionally regulated. Right. And so many of us think that we're emotionally regulated, but we can be set off like an atomic bomb like this.
Yep.
And so
Yeah.
and so really what you want to do is do the work to create a level of awareness in your own mind for
Mhm.
how your own childhood experiences have created this roadmap, right?
Mhm.
Why do you have the emotional patterns that you have? Why do you behave or cope in certain ways?
Mhm.
And once you're able to develop healthier habits to emotionally regulate, that is a game changer because your children are watching you 24/7.
Mhm.
They are learning from you, not just in the interactions that you have directly with them, but in how you speak to your partner, and how you
Mhm.
speak to the person who's checking out your groceries, and how you speak to your friends who come by for a coffee.
Yeah.
They're watching everything. And if they see a level of volatility in you, they assume that that's the right way to be.
Mhm.
So if you're a yeller, like if the way that you
Yeah.
handle things is you yell, and then the kids who eventually turn into teenagers become yellers. You know how many parents have said to me, I don't understand, my kid yells so much. I go, what part don't you understand?
Yeah. It's it's
Where's
it's
the
monkey see,
confusion?
monkey do, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, like really, where's the confusion?
Yeah.
So they will take on your traits, right? That's
Mhm.
what they believe to be acceptable. You're teaching them the ways of the world. And so, again, it's not about being perfect, but, something that I did with my children, because, I remember the years when the toughest years is when they were very young.
Mhm.
My kids were, I think one of my sons was 6 years old and the other one was 4. And I was trying to prepare dinner and the dog was barking and the doorbell rang and my child is trying to get a cookie. And
Mhm.
I'm just so overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Right. And so in that moment, the child's trying to take a cookie and I yell.
Mhm.
Okay. The child goes to his room. That's not, you still have plenty of opportunity at that point in time to just take 10 minutes, calm down,
Mhm.
right? Bring yourself down to baseline. And then maybe after dinner, go back and talk to your son. And or your child. This is something
Yeah.
I've done. I've gone back and I said, I'm really sorry. I didn't handle that well. You know, please accept my apology. I'm sorry if
Mhm.
I hurt you. And why that's so important is because we will all make mistakes. You also have to model for your child how to reconcile these mistakes,
Yeah, of course.
right? But sometimes our egos get in the way. Well, I'm not apologizing to my kid.
Oh no,
Well,
absolutely.
it,
Yeah. Yeah.
you'll see that as you get older, they won't be apologetic towards you either.
No, no, that's very true. And I think it goes for almost every relationship that you have. I mean, everybody who's ever, and I haven't worked in an office in a long time, but everybody who's ever worked in an office or a company knows that the person who puts their hand up when they've made a mistake, that's the trustworthy person. And the person everybody knows made a mistake but keeps quiet about it and hides it, nobody really trusts them. And it's the same with it's the same with parenting and all that type of stuff, right? You erode
Yeah.
the relationship a little bit if you don't take ownership of your mistakes.
That's exactly it. So in the world of attachment theory, what we strive to do is we strive to instill secure attachment in our children. And how
Mm-hmm.
do we do that? Well, really the idea that in the first year of life, a child can do no wrong, right?
True.
The
Yeah.
child just has very specific needs. They need to be fed, they need to be coddled, they need to be changed. In the first year of
Yeah.
life,
Yeah. It
I
is what
know,
it is. Yeah. Yeah.
back in the day, there was a theory about let him cry. Okay.
Yeah. The whole crying it out thing. Yeah, we don't do that anymore. I hope.
No,
I hope
it's
nobody does it anymore that listens to this.
no,
Yeah.
it's terrible. It's
Yeah.
really what it teaches the child is that they're alone.
Yeah.
And so it does the opposite of instill a sense of safety in the child.
Mm-hmm.
So the first year of life, you're really just responding to every need that the child has. After that, you're starting to teach them about emotions, about communications, and you're starting to create predictable patterns with them. So that doesn't mean that you're giving in to everything.
Mm-hmm.
If
Of
there's
course.
a rule that there's no cookies before dinner, then there's a rule that there's no cookies
Yeah.
before dinner, right? Like, and they will learn that and they will respect. So if you respond to the child in a calm way when they themselves are having a tantrum,
Mm-hmm.
then the child has the ability to co-regulate with you, feel your calmness. The child has the option or it feels heard,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if a child is really upset, let's say a 4-year-old child is verbal, is really upset and says, "Mommy, I'm really angry at you."
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. So you might be, a little hurt. You
Mm-hmm.
might, but if you can keep that in control and go, okay, well, sometimes I get angry at people too. So I understand.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to tell me why you're angry at me? And that will de escalate the situation so quickly. But what happens is oftentimes we end up escalating.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
when a child says to us, "Mommy, I'm angry with you," parents, I've heard this so many times, will say, "Well, stop being angry, or I'll give you something to be
I'll
angry
give you
about."
something to be angry about. What are you complaining about? I feed you, don't I? That
Right.
level
I mean,
of yeah,
that's like
yeah.
it's so invalidating. It's so
Mm-hmm.
dismissive. And then, they grow into the teenagers and the teenager who never tells you anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course.
Right? Because why would they? you you didn't display to them that you were a healthy, safe place to connect.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to recognize that these patterns again form really, really early on. And it's the foundation for the relationship that not only you will have with your child, but that the types and quality of relationships that your child will then be able to form with other people in the world.
Yeah, because there's a tremendous, and again, no shaming in this, but there's a tremendous amount of people that I know that say, "Oh, my kid is ABC, can't have relationships at school, doesn't make friends, and all that type of stuff. Is anxious, is stressed." And so much of that stems from as an outsider looking in, you're looking, yeah, but have you seen what your house is like? Like again, with It's more the lack of awareness that
Yes.
that causes the problem rather than the. I'm not saying if you're aware and you're a jackass, that's a problem, of course. But I find most people who are aware of their problem behavior, so to speak, almost inevitably try to change their behavior.
I think awareness is such a key part of this. It's, I've heard so many adults say, well, my parents, they used a belt on me and I
Mm-hmm.
turned out
I turned
fine.
out fine. Yep.
Did you?
Yeah.
I
Well,
mean,
but the old thinking again. This is very much my generational thinking, and I see this with my friends, and most of them will have teenage kids, right? 14, 16-year-old, 17-year-old kids. And we always used to say, as long as you're doing a slightly better job than your parents were, that means that you've improved and your kids, dude. And I'm not crapping on my dad here. He did the best he could, much like yourself, and my mom did the best she could. But that bar is so remarkably low for
yeah,
certain people of my generation that you're like, if I
yeah.
improve slightly, oh, that is nowhere near enough.
No, and what's interesting, Peter, is I don't even think emotional connection was part of that equation. I
Oh
think when they were
no,
talking
no,
about
no,
improve
yeah.
slightly, I think they meant maybe I'm earning a little more, maybe my kids
Mm.
live in a nicer house, maybe that, we eat better food. I
Hit,
think
hit,
those
hit,
it's sort
hit
of
them a bit less. I only shout at my kids. I don't hit them. Right? That's
right.
improvement in parenting, right?
That's improvement, right?
Yeah,
But we can do much better. We
yeah.
know so much more about child development now. So, and we just know that children who develop a secure attachment go out into the world and they are more successful.
Mm-hmm.
They are emotionally regulated. They are happier. They do very well in their careers because they don't have a problem relating to other people. They're comfortable around other people and they're comfortable by themselves. So they can do individual projects, they can do group work. Like they have a
Mm-hmm.
level of mobility in terms of their mindset, right? So the sign of a healthy mind is that fluidity.
Mm-hmm.
So people who are very rigid in their thinking, that's generally a sign of a less healthy mind.
That makes sense. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And so, that secure attachment is really just the foundational. It's like pouring the cement for a house, right? Like it's
Mm.
the foundational piece for what will come next. If you try to build a house, on a piece of land where the foundation has not been poured properly, it'll never stand. A
Mm.
strong
No,
wind will
yeah.
come by and blow it over, right?
It's the old. You can't build a castle on sand, right? It's that old
Yes.
that old saying. Or maybe it's
Yes,
just an old saying where I am.
exactly.
Cool. So let's say people have kind of figured out kind of where they are. Where do they start with? We start with awareness, but we need a bit of guidance here, right? Because I
Yeah.
can fix myself a million times, and every idea I have in my head is a brilliant idea if I keep it in my head, right? My brain tricks me into thinking that I'm a genius. I'm like Kanye West. Everything I have in here is brilliant, and then they blurt
It's
it out, and people
brilliant.
look at me like going, "Dude, you're an idiot." But it's so where do we go? What is the next step when we're like, okay, I have a bit of awareness. How do I then actually
Mhm.
go about doing it?
So there are therapists, and myself included, who work specifically with relationship and attachment trauma. So this
Mm-hmm.
is a very specific field of psychology. I have a group of therapists that work with my team at Securely Loved. On our website at securelyloved.com, you can take a short quiz that will help you identify where you fall on the scale. So that's that first piece of awareness.
Mm-hmm.
So, am I an anxious, preoccupied? Am I dismissive, avoidant? That will help identify things. You can also book a consultation with us to work directly. We have a very specific program where we work with our clients to understand where their core wounds are. This is about
Mm-hmm.
understanding the wounding that they're still carrying around and what sort of behaviors and emotional patterns and thought patterns are they still carrying around these wounds, right? So
Mm-hmm.
far after you leave your family of origin, you might still be employing a number of strategies and coping mechanisms that maybe once served you well when you were a child, but
Sure.
you keep
Yeah.
doing it well after because you haven't made the connection or the association. You know,
Yeah.
there's a very, very strong connection between those who have an insecure attachment and again emotional regulation. We talked about this
Hmm.
because they didn't learn how to emotionally regulate. It wasn't modeled for them in childhood. And so as adults, we see all sorts of potentially troublesome behaviors that emerge out of this too, like the anxious preoccupied is very, very ripe to be in a codependent type of relationship, or to be accepting of an abusive partner.
Hmm.
Or, we see both the anxious preoccupied and the dismissive avoidant who are both very, very ripe for various forms of addictions,
Hmm.
drugs, alcohol, gambling, porn, shopping addiction. Why? Because addiction, and we know addiction today is really about masking, moving away from the pain
Hmm.
that the person doesn't want to feel, right? We used to think addiction was about
Sure.
the substance. It's not.
Yeah.
It's a distraction, right? To
Hmm.
to further distance yourself from these negative feelings that you don't want to feel. But you have these negative feelings because of your emotional patterns, your thought patterns tied to your wounding. So you can see how it all comes full
Hmm.
circle. If you can actually reprogram, which is something we can do, Peter, we can
Hmm.
actually reprogram in the subconscious mind this wounding that we have. Right. So to use an earlier example, if you have wounding that I am or I will be disrespected,
Hmm.
we can work on that so that once that gets healed, you no longer need your plethora of mechanisms to deal with the unpleasant emotions associated to that.
Hmm.
Right? You've
Yeah.
healed the wound. You no longer have to feel that. So running away from the emotions associated with, the pain of some of these wounds is what we find most commonly. That's what people do. They run away
Yeah.
from pain. But listening to your emotions is actually your emotions give you so much valuable information, right? In
Mm.
terms of what you still need to heal. So when I work with clients, I never start off with, tell me about your childhood. Where I
Yeah.
start with is, yeah, because where I start is tell me about something that happened maybe last week that got you really supercharged.
Mm.
Like you were really angry or you felt really frustrated or made you want to cry. Right. And because what I'm looking for are the triggers that still exist in you today,
Yeah. Rather
like
than.
the little active landmines that you still have in you today.
Mhm. Yeah,
Right.
rather
So
than
it's about,
the big event that everybody, because everybody tends to look for the big event, right? When they were growing, as in the why has to be a huge event. This happened when I was 5, and ever since then, I have been blah blah blah. Whereas from my personal experience, my lived experience, which matters a little bit, very little, but since it's my show, I get to mention it. It's the it's much more to do with a build-up of loads of small events rather than the big thing that is wrong is hardly ever the problem. It's all the little things that are not quite right.
right. So we make a distinction between trauma and complex trauma,
Right.
which is sort of like one big thing that happened versus a series of small repetitive things. But really, trauma is not necessarily what happened to us, but it's how we internally processed
Sure.
the event.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So they've done some incredible studies, especially with veterans. So they know, when they've studied veterans who've gone overseas, it's very common to see veterans that come back home
Mm-hmm.
with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
But Peter, as you know, it's not every veteran that comes back with PTSD.
Yeah. No,
And
exactly.
it's not everyone, and they're all exposed to the same level of warfare,
Mm-hmm.
violence, like bloodshed, and they know that out of, let's say, 100 soldiers that come back, 20 of them will display CPTSD.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Why is that? So the research is indicating that there would have already been trauma, wounding within
Mm-hmm.
that individual, that when they went overseas and saw what they saw, it triggered what was already in them that
Mm-hmm.
hadn't been healed. And so if if you already have that wounding, yes, it will trigger a much bigger response,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we talked about like the wounding, I am disrespected. If you don't feel that that's a core wound of yours and someone yells at you, you
Mm-hmm.
will calmly turn around and say, are you okay? Why are you yelling?
Yeah.
Right? You won't
Mm-hmm.
get aggravated because it's not your button.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Of course.
But if it's
Yeah.
your button, you'll push back. So this is what we know to be true. So, just identifying your core wounds, reprogramming them, which we can do at the
Mm-hmm.
subconscious level, is so impactful for you, your children, the quality of your life, the quality of the relationships you'll have. Yeah, it's quite fascinating.
Well, it does sound absolutely, absolutely wonderful. We've touched on tremendous amount of stuff, and I know you're short. I know we're already running over because you have a very, very busy schedule. Was there anything else you wanted to touch on?
No, I just want to reiterate to folks that really the best thing you can do for your children is to ensure that you yourself are emotionally regulated. Because passing that skill,
Mm-hmm.
it's a skill, by the way, emotionally
Of course.
regulations, right? It's not like it's not a temperament, it's not like a genetic, it's not passed down biologically. It's a
Yeah.
skill.
Yeah.
Like you teach your kids how to cook, you
Mm-hmm.
teach them how to identify their emotions and to communicate calmly, right? So that, and if they're feeling frustrated, what to do, what are healthy ways to release that and
Mm-hmm.
come back to baseline. So the more you can get good at regulating your own emotions and then teaching your children to do the same, that is, I believe, one of the most important jobs that a parent has, vis-a-vis their raising of their kids.
Yeah, no, that is what I always say, right? It's the your job as a parent is basically just to raise the most healthy and responsible adult you could possibly put on the planet, and everything else, how you do it, almost doesn't matter as long as that is the end goal. Lovely.
Yeah, so well said. Thank
On
you.
that happy note, I will press stop record here. And press stop record is exactly what I did. Thanks very much to Beth for coming on. That was tremendous for me. That was eye opening. Like I said during the interview, I think everybody who's my age is from a generation that is pretty messed up. And even though I've done I've done a fair bit of work and all that sort of thing, I've spoke to a lot of my friends and all that after I recorded this episode. As I'm recording this, it was about a week or so ago. I've spoken to 3 or 4 people about this and got their thoughts, ideas, and opinions, and I think everybody is very much in the same camp that I was. There was a lot of excellent information that Bev shared and all that sort of stuff. Anyhow, I will of course link absolutely everything. Bev's website, Securely Loved, and all that type of stuff. I highly recommend checking that out. And I have the pleasure of being back next week when I'm talking to Io Hayes about open adoption, which, I know some of you listeners might be, some of you good people might be considering, at least wondering what it's about. I know in the UK everything is open adoption, but in the US it's different, and the pros and cons and benefits, how to manage it, and all that type of stuff. That's what we're discussing next week. For now, though, peter@healthypostnatalbody.com. If you have any questions or comments, or want to get in touch, want to suggest people, and all that sort of thing, right? That's with your email. Thanks very much. If you could rate the podcast, that would be nice, wouldn't it? If you could rate the podcast on Apple or Spotify or something like that, then that would also be greatly appreciated. Anyways, here's a new bit of music. You take care of yourself. Bye now.